Political economist Dr Dale McKinley joins us now on Zoom to speak to us about his thoughts on these developments. Dale, a very good evening to you. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. So this declaring of a national state of disaster, this has been in the public domain and been proposed by various stakeholders for a while now. Why do you think it's only now that government is seriously starting to talk about this issue?
Well, the first reason is not just government, but the ANC in particular, which controls government, is worried about the elections next year. They're in a serious crisis. We're not just in an energy crisis. The ANC itself is in a crisis of legitimacy, of support. And I think there's a final realization, a late realization, that if they don't do things fairly quickly and well, that they're going to pay a really, really heavy price. So I think that's the first thing. The second, of course, is that the economic fallout of this crisis, as well as the more global context that was mentioned previously, is, the forecast of the growth coming from, down 2.7% or whatever it is, it's very anemic. There's people are losing jobs. People are afraid of what lies ahead. There's a general sense in our country of foreboding, of not knowing anything. And I think the government feels that. They're finally feeling that. They're getting a sense that this is not just about a particular change here, a particular there, but it's a very deep-seated crisis. So in that context, they don't have much of a choice. They've got to come up with something. Because if they don't, they're not only going to lose more legitimacy, but they're going to themselves be in peril of losing their own positions eventually as well.
And as you mentioned, the domino effect of the energy crisis is so huge. We were mentioning earlier on that there are concerns around food security. Now, I just want us, for those who are not familiar with what the legislative implications or practically what does it mean if we're saying that the country is going to declare this energy crisis a state of emergency?
Well, if we just cast our minds back to when COVID hit us and the state of emergency or state of disaster was implemented. So basically, it would allow the government to fast track certain spending. It would allow them to bypass certain things that normally you would have to do in terms of policy. It would concentrate more power within the cabinet and within particular ministries, depending upon what the issue is. It would also allow for the deployment, potentially, once again, of other forces of the state, such as the army, if necessary, or particular intelligence security measures. It would allow for new regulations to be passed fairly quickly, again, without going through the whole legislative requirements. So declaring a state of disaster is no small issue. It allows and it concentrates lots of power within the executive and within the cabinet in particular, and particular ministries. And it, as many of the concerns at the beginning of COVID was, if these things are employed fairly regularly, then it becomes normal. It doesn't become an aberration or an extraordinary measure. It becomes a normal measure. And I think there are legitimate concerns around what exactly they're going to do with this state of disaster and addressing the energy crisis, because so far, coming out of Lekgotla, it's not quite clear. I mean, what Mbalula is saying, for example, is that they're going to have an energy crisis committee. They might shift it to the DMRE from public enterprises in terms of Eskom, and a few other things. But right now, I don't think we have a very clear understanding of how the state of disaster would particularly be used in this case.
And as I was listening to you talk about the state of disaster and how it unfolded during COVID-19, there's also the legitimate fear of corruption. So on the one hand, there is a need for urgency in implementing this emergency package, which Fikile Mbalula spoke about. But then there's a lack of detail, as you say. It's not very clear what is being proposed. So is there an entity that can play an oversight role that will ensure that none of those things that we experienced during COVID-19 occur this time around?
Well, here's the conundrum. Declaring a state of disaster sort of necessarily, it doesn't sideline, but it necessarily bypasses Parliament and bypasses a lot of the more democratic, longer-term procedural measures that we have in place, many of the checks and balances, you would say, in the system. And therefore, when you implement a state of disaster like that, what you do is you make it much more difficult for that kind of oversight to take place. And that's precisely why when we had COVID and we saw all this PPE corruption happening, none of us knew anything about it for the first part. I mean, people had ideas that this might be happening, but it was only much, much later that not only the public, but obviously even the government became, I would say, aware of the scale of how much this was happening. So there are legitimate issues here around checks and balances in a state of disaster. Now, it should be that Parliament, our representatives at that level, should be the ones that you would have to, oversight, making sure that things are not abused, that resources are there. You could have an independent panel set up, but I mean, these kinds of things wouldn't have a great deal of power unless they were given emergency powers. So really, it resides within Parliament, and Parliament right now, let's just say it has a mixed record in that regard.
And that's the interesting thing, because you've seen Parliament increase its engagement of members of the executive, of Labour, particularly with the issue around Eskom. But I am asking myself, what likely impact or promised impact, are we looking at here?
Well, I think that if we can get, this is the issue with the state of disaster. It should be an emergency thing. We're dealing with an energy crisis, but we're not just dealing with the energy crisis. Going back to where we started here, we're dealing with an economic crisis. We're dealing with social crisis. We're dealing with a range of other crises. And this requires a much bigger package than simply dealing with Eskom. I mean, should be a priority, and it should be done quickly. But the problem is, if you don't have a proper plans in place, developmental plans and policies that you're going to drive, you can put a lot more money in. You can say this is necessary for us to boost. For example, you could create a large amount of very quick temporary jobs that might give a temporary boost. You could take VAT away on basic foodstuffs, which should be done. You could do all these things, and they would have a potentially positive impact in addressing some of the short-term things, and that's not bad. But the question, of course, is that when you get past the worst points, will it go back to normal? Will it go back to the same kinds of things? And this is fundamentally the question, not only for the cabinet and the ANC, but for Parliament and upcoming elections. That the people of South Africa want to see real change. And that's the question. I don't believe that these measures that are in place right now will answer those questions. We might get a short-term fillip and a boost, but in the longer term, and I mean by longer term, the next 3 or 4 years, we need much more than that.
Thank you so much for your time and insights, Dr. Dale McKinley, political economist. Much appreciated.